Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. More than 77,000 Americans have died of the coronavirus as another 3.2 million applied for unemployment insurance, as Defense Secretary Mark Esper became the latest to warn about downward pressure on the Pentagon budget. Joining us now to discuss the week in Washington are Byron Callan of the independent Washington research firm Capital Alpha Partners, Mackenzie Eaglin of the American Enterprise Institute, and Michael Herson of American Defense International, one of Washington's top defense lobbying firms. Everybody, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Michael, why don't you start us off, as you have on most of these weeks, with updates on where we stand up on the Hill and legislatively. Obviously, hearings are ongoing. General C.Q. Brown, Pacific Air Force's commander, is up for obviously Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, and then obviously retired Rear Admiral Braithwaite is up for Navy Secretary. There's a DNI candidate up there. I should also point out that Admiral Braithwaite, has slammed the Navy for exhibiting a lack of leadership from his standpoint, or a failure of leadership, as he put it. But more broadly, give us a sense on what's going on up on the Hill.
The Senate came back into session after being out for a while earlier this week on Monday. And as you just pointed out, the Senate Armed Services Committee is actively conducting hearings. The Senate is working on confirmation of judges and wants to move other nominations. But the House was initially scheduled to return as well on Monday, and then they reversed their decision after the Capitol physician advised them that it was not safe to return yet until they figured out what the protocols would be for a safe return. Last week, it was reported that 17 construction workers in the Cannon House office building, which is where a third or more than a third of the congressmen have their offices, 17 construction workers that are working on a renovation were found to be infected with COVID-19, along with 12 Capitol police officers. Now, there's a lot of outrage on the Hill because members were not informed by the architect of the Capitol that this had happened. Instead, they found out about it by reading it on Twitter and in the press. So right now, there is no timetable for the House to return. There's a lot of division among them to figure out when and how, and is it worth the risk? I've talked to several members of Congress that say, what is it that we have to do right now, this week or next week, that's so important that's worth putting our staff at risk of dying? And at the same time, they noted that there were not enough COVID-19 tests to go around for all 535 House and Senate members. The White House offered testing, and Pelosi and McConnell turned down that offer of testing because they didn't like the optics of them having access to tests, where a lot of Americans don't. Lamar Alexander, who's a healthcare leader in the Senate, is trying to get them to reverse that decision because he says, hey, look, bringing 535 people to D.C., which is now a hotspot, and then home each weekend, back and forth, is a highly efficient virus spreading machine. So there's a lot of discord internally among how they're going to come back. But regardless, there's still a lot of activity going on the Hill. The staff is working hard still to complete FY21, and work has begun on a fourth stimulus package. The Senate Armed Services Committee finished their work today on the FY21 National Defense Authorization Act. So that is pretty much in the can, just awaiting a markup date. And then this House Armed Services Committee, that bill is also complete with, I think, one outstanding item, but they're finished, and they also are waiting when the House will return and what a process for a markup will look like. The House is harder to manage than the Senate because there's just so many more of them. It'll be more people in a room, so it's just tougher to manage. So they have to figure out how they're going to do that. Appropriations for defense also is about 85% complete for FY21. What's left mostly to do are the classified sections because people can't do those by teleworking, so they need to be in the Capitol to get those done. But Pelosi, as we've been talking about for weeks, feels strongly we need a fourth stimulus package. She continues to lay out the things that she wants to see in it, what they're calling CARES 2. She's asked for input from all her chairmen for earlier this week, and was hoping to roll out something on Friday. I think that's optimistic, but I think we'll see something from the Democrats next week. But Pelosi has said to her folks repeatedly that we need to think big, and she's outlining $1 trillion plus package, which will include things like aid to state and local governments, shoring up the safety net programs, looking at sweeping policies like hazard pay, rent and mortgage relief, additional funding for hospitals, clarification for the District of Columbia, funding for the World Health Organization, additional round of direct economic stimulus payments to individuals, payments for workers on the front lines. So, her own people are privately calling this a spend-a-thon and really a policy wish list. But she's really taking the lead absent, direction from Senate Republicans and the White House. The White House talked about payroll tax cut, which is opposed by Republicans on the Hill. The White House talked about infrastructure, also getting a lukewarm response on Capitol Hill. So, we saw a letter go out 2 weeks ago from 7 senators to Mark Esper, trying to lay the groundwork to say, hey, we want you to keep us informed of the time and resources that are required to recover from this disruption. So they're looking, to give the DoD an entree to say, are the things that you're going to need in this package. And Ellen Lord has made it clear that she's going to need some things to deal with the disruption she's facing from some of the major weapons programs missing their milestones. Adam Smith has come out publicly, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, saying he does not see defense spending in a third stimulus. But I really think what that means is he's not looking at procurement, a major procurement package, as being part of the fourth stimulus package. And I tend to agree he's probably right, but it doesn't mean that there won't be policy implications for defense in this bill, as well as more money for National Guard and defense health programs and some of the relief that Ellen Lord, may require. Now, the department has also been engaged in trying to help industry in addition to the Hill. We saw, for example, the industry facing problems with supply chain, cash flow, and liquidity. And, in response to that, the Pentagon in March, raised its rate of progress payments to contractors from 80% to 90%, and then from 90 to 95%, for small businesses. And this was a big help to industry to help them maintain their supply chain. However, as partisanship continues to reign and, the comedy continues to deteriorate, Senator Warren sent a letter to Esper, sounding the alarm about the increased progress payments the Pentagon is making to contractors, warning that the move will result in waste, fraud, or abuse. So she's pressing Ellen Lord, for details on the decision, and she's concerned that contractors may not pass these payments to subcontractors, and large companies will use this money for stock buybacks and profiteering. So, the situation continues to deteriorate. I think that hopes of a fourth package coming quickly are nil. People in the Republican leadership tell me June at the earliest, and they really are taking more of a wait and see approach to see what the impacts are and see how the money's spent from the third package.
There are also concerns by some smaller businesses that the throughput of that money, that the intent was to try to get it from the big contract, from DoD to the big contractors on down to smaller guys. And there's been a little bit of a slow up in the system as everybody works to sort of calculate the financial impact of this. It's interesting that you point that out, Michael, and I want to go to Mackenzie in a moment, but I just wanted to ask you that National Defense Industrial Association sent a letter about DoD performance stipulations that drew some pushback. Do you think that's going to change the vector?
No, I do not, because as you know, there's policy in this town and there's process, and process has overtaken this letter, because this letter is dated yesterday, and the House has finished their bill. It is finished, and the Senate put their pencils down today. So regardless of the efficacy of this letter, it's really too late to have a serious impact on the FY21 process.
Mackenzie, I want to go to you. Dr. Esper spoke at the Brookings Institution. Michael O'Hanlon orchestrated a great conversation. And during that, the Defense Secretary made a very, very thoughtful case. He said that the coronavirus is going to put downward pressure on the defense budget, that a strong nuclear capability is the foundation of U.S. national security. He made a case for sea power. He made a case for a truly joint force. But he also said that legacy systems should be sacrificed to have more modern future capabilities. And he's been saying what a lot of people have been saying about downward pressure on the budget, but still made a case for that 3 to 5% increase. What was your sense on the message and whether or not it is ultimately going to change anything?
I think it's a good sales job. It's important that he keeps talking about the same things with different audiences all over the place, particularly as resistance to him, different things he's doing grows around town. He's had a really good long stretch as secretary without a lot of criticism to his credit. But now, this is just a tough time, and he's taken, arrows from a couple different sides. So I'm glad he is laying out thoughtful cases. The challenge here is that that's a mixed message. We need 3 to 5% growth, but if I have to cut legacy programs to pay for NDS, I will. I even kind of have a sense of what they are. And, oh, by the way, if defense has to be cut, we'll live with it. So I don't know that that's the most helpful thing to tell members of Congress, or to the general public itself.
Any sense on all the stuff that's going up on, that Michael talked about on Capitol Hill, and how the department and its supporters can better steer the debate up there?
They need to just start talking. So, Chairman Smith's comments, I take Michael's point on the nuance, oh, we're not going to throw in, extra F-35s. Okay, duh, right, got it. But there is significant need at the Defense Department in the next stimulus. And there's already talk, in some corners of Washington that we don't need another stimulus. $3+ trillion in, mere weeks is plenty of spending. DoD needs money for the uniformed force to mitigate stop movement orders, to increase PPE and sanitation, to expand IT infrastructure for telework. That's just a little, that's just like a little taste of what the uniformed forces need. But really, this is about liquidity, as Michael talked about, to the thousands of small businesses, subcontractors, the tier 3 and 4 vendors and suppliers. They're doing maintenance. They're developing classified software. Yes, building weapons. This is an industrial base. It's built for maximum efficiency, not resiliency. So when you have like a minor production pause of, say, just a couple weeks at no penalty, thankfully, to Ellen Lord, then you combine broader quarantine restrictions, program schedules get upended. So even if the Pentagon is using all of its tools, it's accelerating awards and progress payments, it's lifting restrictions, it's trying to do everything it can, but the acquisition team can't respond to this crisis without more resources, as in dollars. So if you don't have more liquidity, contractors face this choice between letting workers go, and then you potentially may not, they may not return, or that they won't have a job to return to because they're going to do something else. And so, I am pleased that Secretary Esper seems to be very aware that it's the 3rd and 4th tier that are the most vulnerable. They have less slack to respond to crises. They don't have legal shops. They don't have IT shops. That they're really, they're the fragile part of the industrial base, and also the ones you want to hold on to most importantly. But I'm not sensing a whole lot of goodwill on the Hill for this point. And there is a jobs component to it. The Defense Department doesn't exist to prop up jobs, but they absolutely are, by extension, are supported through this $750 billion budget. And he needs to also, I think, get busy, and all of his lieutenants, raising awareness with policymakers about these needs.
Well, and there are a lot of folks in DoD, especially on the acquisition side of the house, who make the case that, look, we control a lot of resources, and it's very, very important for us to open up those taps. Hondo Gertz is one of them. Ellen Lord certainly has made that case as well. Jim Smith over at U.S. Special Operations Command, his interview will be airing on Monday to coincide with our SOFIC coverage. And he made the case, look, we have $7 billion, and we can try to put as much of that as quickly into the economy, not just to satisfy our own needs, but also help at a time when the economy is hurting. Byron, you've been following this very closely and writing about it as well. What are some of your takeaways, not just on what Secretary Esper said, but also what's going on up on the Hill?
Well,
and again, $17 billion that's still gone untapped as of last count.
Yeah, and let me just bridge some of the stuff that both Michael and Mackenzie talked about, because they both, as usual, make very good points. Look, I think, listening to some of the conference calls that management's had last week and this week, the messaging is for the large public companies, we got that message loud and clear. We are trying to help our smaller subcontractors, and that money will flow down. And I think it's important to a lot of these companies have suspended their share buybacks. They haven't eliminated their dividend, but I see this a lot in Washington, D.C., that there's kind of this confusion between progress payments and profits. And so, from a DoD or a contractor standpoint, this is really just a timing of cash flow. It's not going to change the ultimate profitability on the program. When you're just accelerating the cash payments, and that's going to create some budget issues. I think, however, and this is another interesting point that's going to come up. It was alluded to, I think, in KBR's conference call last week that they've seen a shortfall in some of their expectations for support they were going to give to some of the large exercises. The European Defender exercise, if I'm getting that one correct, is one that they called out in particular. So I think for the FY20 budget, it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of rescissions, what kind of room there's going to be to play with monies that were going to be spent on some of these training exercises on fuel, for example, in the working capital part of the budget, and what kind of headroom that might create that the DoD may be able to use, not just go back to Congress and ask for more money. Having said that, I do think you could probably make a legitimate case that, hey, we, above and beyond the medical related, N95 PPE type stuff and what's going on with the Defense Healthcare Program that we saw in CARES Act, there's going to be a need for some more cash to be infused in the Department of Defense to deal with these timing issues. And I think to Mackenzie's point, I just add the smaller tier, and I absolutely think DoD gets this. The issue for a lot of those contractors, when you get into third and fourth tier, they're typically not pure defense. If they do, it's a machine shop that may do 30% of its business with the Department of Defense. But if the other 70% of their business is with the automotive sector or the civil aviation sector, they've got a real problem on their hand. And I think it really behooves the Department of Defense to be very attuned to that and pay attention to that, which they are. On Esper's comments, kind of agree. I don't think there's a whole lot new that was said. I think the problem that's emerging, if national defense strategy is based on 3 to 5% consistent real growth, that's the message, but that's not the reality. And at some point, it's occurring now, more and more people are going to be asking, okay, what gives, what has to change in that strategy if it's not going to be properly resourced? And there have been a couple of interesting essays that have been coming out. I don't particularly see this, but where you could get into some very steep defense spending. You're talking
about the two essays, one by Barno and the other by Metz.
Yeah, by Steve Metz. Metz pointed, this was Steve Metz is with the Strategic Studies Institute of the Army War College, who talked about, hey, this could really have some very dire implications for the Army. He had some very interesting thoughts about how national security attitudes can change. I mean, we're all kind of in the speculative, what kind of questions should people be thinking about right now? But, the point is 3 to 5% was optimistic before COVID-19, unless there's some major breakdown in the national security environment, which is possible. That looks like an even bigger stretch. So it's good that the secretary's on message. I suppose the last thing that I'll say, because he did talk about shedding legacy equipment even faster. Mackenzie and Michael both have had experience with this. I just wonder how possible that's going to be in an environment where, you talk about shedding legacy equipment, a lot of that will result in actual unit disbandments in states. And at a time in 2020 and 2021, where states are going to be keenly looking at shoring up their job bases, any threat of a retirement that impacts a local military unit, I think is going to be even less palatable for the Department of Defense to pursue. They should eventually get there. It's absolutely the right thing to do, but the political reality of a very high unemployment rate, the need to get the economy back up and running, and the gap between when some of these new systems could be fielded and when current stuff would be retired, I think it's not something I would put high on my list of expectations.
And the other, when we said dueling essays, the other one was by retired Army Lieutenant General Dave Barno and Nora Ben-Sahel on the 5 ways the U.S. military will change after the pandemic. I think that was the other essay you were talking about, right, Byron?
Absolutely, and that was another one that, again, I don't agree with it, but it's very thoughtful. It's a direction that's possible. I think I'm in the middle of writing something up where it's like you really kind of have to think about some of the markers that you would have to see to believe that some of this is more probable. It's not going to happen in 2020, but it is clearly, there's a wide cone of probabilities and possibilities that starts to play out through 2021 and beyond. So it's all good stuff, and I'd love to see more of it. I'd love to see some of it on the other side that, hey, there really could be a breakdown in the security environment, and that 3 to 5% might be 5 to 7% if we're not careful here.
And now a word from our sponsor. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more. And a shout out to all of our sponsors. Leonardo DRS sponsors our global coverage. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and broader cyber coverage. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. And Elbit Systems of America is sponsoring our trade show coverage. Let me get you guys' sense on this whole Legato story that's clearly been brewing for a long time. Obviously, the company was allocated new spectrum by the Federal Communications Commission. If I recall, they did so on a unanimous basis, but they did so over the objection of the national security apparatus, complaining that the granting of this spectrum would interfere with everything from the global positioning system to other sorts of capabilities. Mackenzie, there was a hearing up on the Hill on the Senate side. Nobody from the FCC was there. Nobody from Legato was there. It was more sort of for national security people to sort of make their case about why this was a really, really bad idea. All the national security chairmen have written about this, complaining about the decision. At the end of the day, how the heck did we get here? And what are the real implications of this decision?
That was a remarkable hearing, wasn't it? It was incredibly technical and long and detailed, and even members of Congress were asking really detailed questions. It was very interesting. How did we get here? Well, the White House knows.
Tim Kaine was one of the senators saying, it would have been, not that he was at all agreeing with Legato, but he was like, well, this would be a great opportunity to hear the other side of the story. And that's the purpose of a hearing, right? Is to learn as opposed to just grandstand purely. But
there is a bit of a jurisdictional issue here, obviously, with the Commerce Committee, which I think is why it was such a remarkable hearing, because there's only so many tools that the Armed Services Committee has to sway this FCC decision. But all the parties know, the White House knows, Congress knows, and the Pentagon knows they have to provide and protect alternatives to Huawei. And they have to combat China's potential dominance in this 5G, this newest era of communication, which once we have it, everybody's going to want it. And they're going to want it immediately. And so, DoD's been testing ways to share its mid-band 5G spectrum for a few months, actually. But instead of waiting for the results, Legato wants to repurpose L-band spectrum adjacent to GPS frequencies. So for this terrestrial cellular network, they call it. The challenge is it's not about the commercial networks. It's about, there is an issue here with the military has an over-reliance on GPS, but that doesn't get fixed overnight. They can't switch quickly to an alternative navigation system. So that is an issue for the longer term, but really they have to allocate more time and money if this goes forward from DoD, money they don't have, as we just talked about, or probably won't have, to repairing impacted GPS receivers and mitigating other sort of mission disruptions. And so this is it's a big problem for the Air Force. The chief has said there might be some ways to parcel out the spectrum and share it, but we can't leave it. We're not leaving it. And so even though there's a green light for Legato for the moment, the Pentagon's going to have to figure out a way to offer the private sector safe alternatives to develop 5G networks, and they're going to have to move faster than they normally move as a bureaucracy.
Byron, what do you think the implications here are, and how do you think this plays itself out?
Well, I think it's probably going to wait for 2021. I mean, Mackenzie made the point. Senate Armed Services Committee has no jurisdiction over the FCC. So if Commerce had held this hearing, it probably would have been a lot more interesting and impactful, but it didn't. And you know, the other interesting thing I think is you've got the Secretary of State Pompeo, who's been in favor of the Legato decision, and I think that's intriguing because you know, the personal relationship between himself and the Secretary of Defense, and you'd think that this could have been aired and explained in any number of instances before you had to have a hearing to kind of air the DoD concerns on this. So, and then there's even a more bizarre part. I mean, I've read stuff that you know the approach that Legato is taking is not necessarily the approach of 5G. I'd also point that Dave Ignatius wrote something in the Washington Post that I think probably needs a little bit more attention, and it's been talked about for a couple of months here. I don't think he struck on anything new. He just shined a light on it that you know, we ought to be thinking about something above and beyond 5G and moving to 6G. There are a whole range of other technologies. A lot of them are US based that you can leapfrog 5G and move into you know, for lack of a better term, 6G, but there are going to be other ways to skin this cat, and I think you know, probably going to have to wait till 2021 to see something really substantive change here.
Michael, anything you want to add?
Byron and Mackenzie got it pretty spot on, and I think that the jurisdictional issues are the biggest challenges that Congress is going to face in dealing with this issue, as well as the divide in the administration.
We've got a little bit less than 10 minutes, and I wanted to ask you guys about a couple of other certainly curious stories. Byron, you win the award in the prep. We were talking about the bizarre invasion coup attempt of Venezuela by former Green Berets that was quashed by Nicolas Maduro's forces. You called that the Bay of Piglets. That's someday either going to be a comedy or a Netflix series. On that, I think that the Washington Post deserves some good credit for the way that they've been covering that. Let's talk about two other kind of curious stories. One is that the White House is sending an enforcer, apparently, to the Pentagon to ensure that the civil service is being or is going to be loyal to the president, which certainly is unusual. It's going to be Michael Catrone, according to a story in Foreign Policy, who's going to be doing that job. And then the other story is apparently that anybody who's had coronavirus is going to be a coronavirus survivor will be excluded from future military service, which would seem to be a very, very bizarre thing to do from a recruiting standpoint. What do you guys make of those two stories?
I saw these stories this morning, and it prevented me from getting to many other stories that I wanted to get to because my head was spinning when I saw them, and I started to copy the links and send them to some members of Congress to get their response to these. And I sent to both Republicans and Democrats, and you know, without fail, each one responded to me like, "This makes no sense. This is crazy." And of course, you know, the Democrats responding to the fact that the president is sending an enforcer over to the Pentagon, obviously saying this is all the more reason why they need to win in November. But, you know, I mean, it's you know, the latter story, you know, is more, again, of the breakdown of, you know, and how government's functioning and more partisanship, where it's all becoming more about loyalty to the president than about what's best for our country, you know, and people doing their job. And, you know, I think, look, some of that's still also reflected in what we talked about earlier with the letter, I think, you know, Elizabeth Warren sent over to OSD, you know, complaining about progress payments. You know, she also sent a letter complaining about their response to the pandemic. Well, you can't have it both ways. You know, the Pentagon's responding to the pandemic, trying to help out here, and then you send another letter complaining that they're not, you know, they're not doing well with, you know, with their response. But, you know, I think, you know, the president continues to give his enemies ammunition, not just, you know, with those two stories, but, you know, we also saw earlier today that the CDC has come out with 17 pages of guidance on how to reopen, how do people go back to work, or go back to church, go back to school. And the administration is not allowing the CDC to release that information. I guess they don't like, you know, what's in there, which makes it harder for the country to get going again. And I would think, you know, this is obviously going to make it harder for it's hard enough for the military to recruit right now. I mean, you know, as you know, I mean, 71% of the people in this country that are ages 18 to 24 are already ineligible for military service because they can't do basic math or English, or they're unhealthy. So why do we want to make it even harder, for the military to be recruiting? So I think this is going to end up with a lot of opposition on Capitol Hill, both Republicans and Democrats.
Mackenzie?
Agree. I think this was potentially some sort of trial balloon, and it's going to immediately pop. It's a really incredibly dumb idea for a town full of them. Also many good ideas, but this one is really it's just plain silly. So I think that it's going to die as fast as it popped its head up, and which is a good thing, because not only is it just bad policy, I mean, right. So the military is already recruiting with one hand tied behind its back. So, and for all the reasons Michael said, but also drug and criminal records, minor petty things that, like we saw during the Iraq War when waivers had to be issued. So they're competing against a population, a shrinking pool, and everybody else is competing for that same shrinking pool to do other various jobs in the nation. It's also potentially counter policy, maybe even against the law. I've not looked into this. I'm pretty sure it may not be explicit, but implicitly that sounds really dicey territory, legally or statutorily or regulatory. I'm not really sure which one, but I just think it's okay. Let's hope that this is the last time we ever talk about that article. Regarding
And what about the enforcer idea?
Right. So
because Mark Esper has been doing a really, really good job in trying to support as best he can. I mean, without lawyering for the Defense Secretary, but I think he's been very on message to try to balance the equities of the department, the independence of the department, and focusing on what the department's going to do, while still being very supportive of the president and not coming across at least as disrespectful or as problematic, perhaps, as Jim Mattis did in his tenure as Defense Secretary. I
agree with all of that. I do. I think he deserves a lot of credit. He's been a really strong secretary, which is good when it's the last year of an administration. That's what you always hope for, but don't always get. So I totally agree with your analysis. I don't know that this was, his decision, or he was able to even weigh in on it. I guess I'm shocked by it because there's already tremendous White House reach down at all levels of DOD already into personnel matters. I serve on a board of a war college, and I'm going to leave it at that and say there's already deep White House reach into small personnel issues. So I don't know that it's needed. It seems a little redundant to me.
Okay. Michael, let me quickly ask you, from a confirmation standpoint, obviously the vote for DNI is going to be along party lines, likely on the Senate. CQ Brown, the PACF commander, is so qualified that I expect that's going to pass unanimously as well to become the next Chief of Staff of the Air Force. How do you think Braithwaite and the DNI and a couple of the other positions are going to go?
I think that Braithwaite has a chance of not just passing with just Republican votes. I think that he will get some Democratic votes as well. I haven't had a chance to watch the coverage of his hearing today, but I've been talking to the folks in OSD who have been helping shepherd through his confirmation, and they don't seem to be any major roadblocks in his path.
Byron, let me quickly ask you kind of a broader macro economic question. You've been covering capital markets for 40 years, and you're not just have been covering them, but you're also a student of financial markets and military history and international history. From your standpoint, how does this look? Because there's a sense, something like 77% of Americans who file for unemployment insurance think that they're going to get their old jobs back right away. What's your sense on how this economically potentially plays out?
I think the first point is it's really going to depend on the path of COVID-19. If we, unfortunately, some areas of the country, New York metropolitan area for one, has started to see kind of a plateauing and actually a drawdown. But look, the caseloads are still rising in other parts of the country that have largely been immune from this. And I think that's going to be true from a global standpoint. So, as much as people hope that this is going to be short and sweet, it could be long and very bitter. I think, I keep coming back to this. The ability or the resilience of the U.S. population to withstand something as disruptive as COVID-19. What was the old think? I think it's like 40% of Americans had less than $1,000 in savings that they could draw on an emergency basis. It's going to be very interesting if we have a relapse in COVID-19, maybe even a different strain. In the fall and winter this year. I think that's when you're really talking about some very, very ugly, ugly economic scenarios. And I don't know what we're going to do. Read about these budget shortfalls. I mean, Michael talked about the stimulus package up on the Hill. There was a story in the Chicago Tribune this week that I think Illinois is looking at a 500. It's a large number, $5 billion hole in their transportation budget because of the fall off in gasoline tax revenue. So I was listening to something earlier today on New England and what's happening to the New England tourism industry. And, a lot of these things are just not built for, you can't socially distance on a charter fishing boat. So there are little things like this that I think when you really start to pick through all the ramifications, as much as stock markets are roaring ahead here, I kind of look at it, it's like a dog on a chain, and there's going to be a snapback here that could be very, very ugly if we don't turn this corner on COVID-19 in the summer. And I'm skeptical we are going to turn the corner as quickly as the market's making it out to be.
Do you think that if COVID is cooperative, is this more of a V-shaped recession, or is this something that's actually a deeper U, something that we have a tendency of talking about on the Sunday podcast with Ron Sash?
This is a pandemic, and pandemics have been part of history. There'll be a recovery. I think the question is how and when. Something there was a story earlier this week that I think something like 40% of the bars in Washington, D.C. may close because of the COVID-19. But okay, so landlords will have to lower their rent. People are going to go bankrupt. But if you think about some of these areas of the economy, Washington, D.C. is a perfect case in point. It's not like 40% of government workers are losing their jobs. There's going to be a basis that you could see a lot of these things come back. And of course, this is kind of what Secretary Esper mentioned in his talk at Brookings. We're on uncharted territory on the magnitude of federal debt. The last time we got to this was in World War II. We have ultra low interest rates right now, and maybe they're going to stay low longer than all of us expect. But boy, if they start to creep up again and the US government has to start funding this at 3 or 5% interest rates, interest outlays are really going to start crowding out other parts of the federal budget without something being done dramatically to, and we all know this on this broadcast, the problem with federal spending has not been defense spending. It's all the other things that the entitlement programs, healthcare, things like that are the bulk of federal spending. And if you don't raise taxes or you don't get on to those other non-defense entitlement programs, the hammer's going to fall on defense and the other non-defense discretionary parts of spending. And that's not a good outcome for the country.
And let's go quickly around the horn to see what you guys are going to be looking for and watching out for over the coming week. Michael, why don't you start us off?
Well, I think first to see if the House is able to figure out timetables to when they can come back to D.C. so they can complete their work on the FY21 authorization appropriations bills and pass a fourth stimulus package out of the House to at least begin the discussion on the fourth stimulus package. We'll also be looking to see what the Republicans in the Senate are going to say about a fourth package beyond the red line that McConnell's laid down about liability protections for companies that get their workers exposed or patrons exposed to COVID-19 if they do reopen. And then, what the White House says about a possible fourth package. And also the White House, shifting gears on their coronavirus task force, which they were initially going to wind down, then decided now they're not going to wind down. So what image or vision are they going to have? And if they're going to block the CDC rules for how we're going to reopen, what are they going to put forth in its place to give Americans the confidence to go back to work again, or to go back to restaurants again, or the do's and the don'ts. So I'm curious to see how that evolves.
Mackenzie?
So I'm going to be tracking the Secretary of Defense and his team, including the reaction to today's hearing for several new Pentagon political appointees. This is an interesting time that Congress chose to have these hearings and there's not a particular urgency to fill any of them. I mean, besides the widespread vacancies, but except for arguably the Navy. the reaction in Washington surrounding, how the hearings are going, overlaid with, as I mentioned earlier, all the arrows coming in at Secretary Esper. He had harsh words for Congress, not at Brookings, but at his press conference earlier this week, where he addressed some of the letters that Michael outlined and said, basically the governors of the states from where the members sent me separate letters don't agree. And everybody thinks we're doing great. And I think we're doing great. And then on another issue later in the press conference, he said, an oversight is good from Congress, but it needs to be informed oversight. I mean, he's a nice guy, but those were like his version of harsh words. And I hope that the relationship doesn't deteriorate, but I'm just watching the secretary.
Well, he's also mirroring his boss, right? To a degree. Byron?
There's still going to be a couple of companies reporting. You mentioned Venezuela earlier. I still think we're in clearly an extremely dynamic global environment. I'd look at kind of the state of U.S.-China relations. The president had threatened to I think there's an interesting touch point coming on. President had said he was going to look at kind of the state of the phase 1 trade agreement this coming week, and that could be another flashpoint with China. I'd keep an eye on what's going on in the Middle East. Iraq looks like its new government is kind of settling down. There was an announcement today that the U.S. is going to be withdrawing one of the Patriot batteries from Saudi Arabia. So I think that's kind of a signal for Iran to kind of keep tweaking us. There's a risk still that if things heat up again in Iraq via IRGC forces, that could all blow up in our faces too. So, and I go back to Venezuela. I just think as much as everybody's focused on Indo-Pacific, COVID-19 could have some really wild ramifications for places in the world that we just haven't paid a lot of attention to.
Guys, thanks very much again. Really appreciate it, especially you, Mackenzie, because I know you were on a very, very short string today. So thanks very much for joining us.
You bet.
Thank you, Vago.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. Check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman and our broader Navy coverage that's sponsored by Fincantieri Marinette Marine. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.